Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Weeb Union, and in this one the Russians have managed to advance in several sectors of the front line in the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region, the northeastern flank of Pokrovsk, to the west of the Serebets river line, and across the border between the Kursk and Sumy regions. The Russians continued offensive operations as a part of their summer offensive and as an extension of previous operations along the border area between the two countries, as well as the outskirts of the four regions. Starting out in the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region, the Russians entered into the Zaporizhzhia region, gained control over Timirivka and several fortified positions to the south and to the north of Timirivka, as well as Zelene Pole. Russians gained control over several fortified positions and defensive lines of the Ukrainians along the border area and along the main road. This is a part of the Russians' larger operation currently taking place along the second line of defense of the Ukrainians that passes through the Dnipropetrovsk region but is used to defend the Zaporizhzhia region. The Russians are currently fighting over the first and second lines of defense. Their push towards Timirivka is a capture of the easternmost positions of the first line of defense, while the recent capture of Meliivka further north is an operation on the second line of defense, and these are both working on the dip that is on the second line of defense, pushing towards the first line of defense over these settlements to the northwest. The Russians are doing a combined strike on both the first and second lines of defense from the eastern flank at the weak point of these defensive lines, and they will slowly be working through these defensive lines to gain control over the fortifications east of Huliaipole, which connects to one of the main highways that connects to the eastern flank of Zaporizhzhia. The Russians will here work on improving the logistical situation of their forces, the current weakness, and what prevents the Russians from launching a larger scale operation here on the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region is the lack of supplies. Logistical hubs for the Russians in the area at the frontline positions are Velika Novosilka, which is really just a small town, and Kurakhove, which is a small city. Both are supplied mainly through Donetsk, and that makes it difficult. The road from Mariupol to Velika Novosilka is very far, and generally from Russian cities as well. Instead, if they gain control over additional highways through Huliaipole, through Pokrovsk, they'll be able to have additional highways that connects their forces in several sectors. This will allow them to spread out the supply lines, having multiple roads and having better logistical hubs near the front line where they can stash up their supplies. Currently, stashing their supplies in Velika Novosilka, they will not allow them to stash too much because they'll be easy targets and there isn't a lot of cover for it. But in cities such as Pokrovsk, Huliaipole, and generally larger cities along the front line, Pokrovsk within the Dnipropetrovsk region, these areas can stash a lot more supplies, allowing for larger operations. Otherwise, the Russians would constantly have to resupply their frontline positions in a very difficult position, and these are all vulnerable to drone strikes and long-range artillery MLR strikes. This is why the Russians are currently working on these tactics where they use few soldiers and vehicles to gain control over settlements along the front line and flank the fortified positions from their rear, getting control over these fortified positions, slowly moving through them, will allow the Russians to cut off the supply line directly towards Huliaipole, isolating it from the north, and with combined efforts from the further north and with the capture of Pokrovsk, the Russians can develop offensive operations in the western direction, getting control over additional logistical hubs with several highways leading to these locations, allowing the Russians to gather more troops, spreading out the supply lines, and having additional logistical hubs to keep their goods safe. For more on this analysis, you can check out my video from yesterday where I cover the first phase of the three phases of the Russian summer offensive. Further north, the Russians are flanking Pokrovsk from the north, where they have managed to gain control over the hill here to the northwest of the industrial area, west of Novoakademishne. With the high ground under their control, the Russians are now able to flank the industrial area, strike the supply line leading up to it and the fortified positions near Novokanamishne, and overlook Mirnorod in its entirety, as well as direct vision of the highway leading into Pokrovsk from the high ground. It also covers the northern flank for a push towards Lyman, and it generally helps improve the reconnaissance and the combat ability of the Russian forces in the northeastern flank of Pokrovsk. The Russians are slowly working their way towards the highway north of Pokrovsk to cut it off. It is necessary for the Russians to capture Rodinsk to achieve this, cutting off the northern supply route. This is why the Russians are working on the southern and northern flanks near Zaporizhzhia and Lyman. The Ukrainians counterattacked from Rodinsk towards Rasine. Now the Russians are closing this by attacking on the northern and southern flanks, bypassing the fortified positions now under Ukrainian control to regain control of it, while they flanked their initial Ukrainian counterattack by attacking the northern and southern flanks, outflanking and outmaneuvering the Ukrainian forces. Now the Russian push continues in the direction of Rodinsk from the northern and southern flanks along the fortified positions and settlements here to the north of Pokrovsk. This is again to gain control over a large logistical hub for the Russian forces to build up a large enough grouping to flank the Sloviansk-Konstantinivka line in the northeast, as well as enter into the Dnipropetrovsk region to the west, along both the Dnipro highway as well as the Zaporizhzhia highway. At the end of 2023 and start of 2024, while the Russians were fighting over Avdiivka, following the capture of the city, the Russians were able to gain control over a large portion of the front line within a year, where the Ukrainians lost one fortified position after another, leading to the Russian capture of Khodorkovy, Svetligove, and many other logistical hubs that are smaller and close to Pokrovsk, aligning the front line with Pokrovsk, where the front then slowed down significantly as Russians started working on the flanks of Pokrovsk rather than directly towards the city, in preparation for the siege of the city, which is now taking place. The capture of Pokrovsk will lead to a similar case, except the Ukrainians would have less fortified positions and more open areas, which means that the Russian advances will be much faster this time around. The capture of these positions on the northern and western flanks of Pokrovsk will be quick, and the Russians will be able to establish a large logistical hub within Pokrovsk, connecting to several areas: Konstantinivka from the south, Ryshkivka and Kramatorsk from the west, the rear of the Donetsk region, cutting off additional supply lines leading into the Sloviansk-Konstantinivka line and into the Dnipropetrovsk region, bypassing the fortified defensive lines of the Ukrainians in the south of Zaporizhzhia, allowing for offensive operations towards logistical hubs within the Dnipropetrovsk region, where the Ukrainian fortified positions are much fewer and sparse, leading to quicker Russian advances with less resistance, and the Russians will be capturing positions at a much faster pace. And that is why it is not impossible, although unrealistic, that the Russians gain full control over the four regions by the end of 2025. It'll likely go further into summer 2026 before the Russians gain full control over all four regions, unless the Ukrainian army collapses. And this will all be centered around the Russians gain control over the last fortified lines that are well organized within the Donetsk region, and starts moving into the Dnipropetrovsk and Zaporizhzhia regions from the rear. In the northern parts of the Donetsk region, the Russians continued offensive operations beyond Selina Dolina. The Ukrainian sources reported a counterattack towards the town, but with this geolocated footage, we now see that the Russians continued offensive operations west of Selina Dolina in an attempt to gain control over the forest lines here to the southwest of the town, leading into Sandrihulove, which is one of the main supply lines for the Ukrainian forces within Lyman. The Russian advances significantly slowed down, with several Ukrainian counterattacks as the Russians got close to the logistical hubs for the Ukrainian forces. The Russians are here working on recapturing the positions along the river line on the northern flank, and then pushing further towards Sereshne and Sandrihulove here on the southern flank to cut off the main supply line into Lyman from the northwestern direction, as they push further down towards the main logistical hubs such as Zaporizhzhia, Novosibirsk, and Yarova here to the southwest, which allowed the Russians to gain control over all of the logistical lines connecting to Lyman from the northwest. It also allowed the Russians to start offensive operations on the flank of the fortified positions north of Lyman, and with their recent advances on the eastern flank in the Zaporizhzhia forest direction, the Russians looking to gain control over the eastern bank of the Zaporizhzhia line in its entirety. This, combined with assaults on the western flank, will allow the Russians to operationally encircle Lyman and start the siege of the town. Finally, along the border in the Sumy Kursk direction, the Russians made a small advance along the border area, gaining control over a foothold here along the forest line to the south. The Russians are here working on gaining control over roads that connect between the Kursk and Sumy regions, gain control over Alexandria and Myropilya here in the border section to gain control over the eastern parts of the Sel River, expanding the zone of control along the border area and gaining control over this pocket the Ukrainians have along the border area. The logistical situation for the Ukrainians in this area and for the Russians in this area is fairly weak. The Ukrainians is much better as they have settlements that are fairly large for towns along the border area. This allows them to concentrate a significant amount of forces, while the Russians have to push through river lines and marsh areas to supply their forces, making it difficult to concentrate anything larger than, at best, a company-sized unit. This makes it difficult for the Russians to advance and supply their forces to entrench themselves within locations they've captured, and fighting continues over the outskirts of Myropilya and the border area between the Russians and the Ukrainians here in the Sumy region. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.